Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the great honor to serve as president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true on campus or online, as it has for 151 years since our founding and through not one, but two global pandemics. From the very beginning of Hunter's history, that dream has been available to people of all races, religions, cultures, and national origins. Not only was Hunter one of the first schools to open its doors to women, it was also among the first to admit students of all backgrounds. And though we have remained in social isolation this past year, separated from our colleagues, we have continued to teach and learn remotely, with equal opportunity and diversity still among our core commitments to our students, our faculty, and each other. Of course, that same commitment must extend to all aspects of our lives at every level of society, community, city, state, and country. Recently, the city and the nation have been roiled by a series of appalling, unprovoked physical attacks on Americans of Asian descent, a scourge that has terrorized our friends and neighbors and shocked people of fairness and sound judgment everywhere. It is hard to fathom this outbreak unless it grew from the outrageous ethnic scapegoating that placed so-called blame for COVID-19 on people from a particular province, city, country, or continent. As the wave of violence shows, the coronavirus pandemic has cost us dearly, even beyond the horrific toll of illness and death left in its wake. Now, as we've long hoped and prayed, the virus is finally on the way to eradication here in New York, and eventually, we trust, elsewhere around the country and the world. Science is winning the battle, but the outbreak of anti-Asian violence that began in the wake of COVID-19 is threatening to grow into another epidemic, one that cannot be cured in a laboratory or by a vaccine. To discrimination and hatred, anger and blame, we must respond with our heads and our hearts, in our homes and classrooms, by working to expose, denounce, and eradicate it. Together, we can resist any and all attempts to pit people against each other or to target individual or groups. The answer to the attacks on some is defending the rights and safety of all. There's no better time to address Asian American hate in the pandemic age than right now, during Asian American and Pacific Island Heritage Month. And we are so proud that Hunter's own Asian American Studies Center has organized this evening's event, featuring leaders from academia, government, and the community who have joined us in the virtual Roosevelt House space to offer their concerns and their proposals. Thank you, Professor Vivian Louie, Director of Hunter's Center for Asian American Studies, for putting together this crucially important discussion. Let us hope it leads to new understanding and an action plan that Hunter's Center can help implement. It's a pleasure to now introduce this evening's distinguished panel. First, we are so pleased to welcome business and community leader and a longtime friend to Hunter College and CUNY, Wellington Chen. Wellington is Executive Director of the Chinatown Partnership, a group that was formed in the wake of 9/11 to protect one of New York's most extraordinary historic neighborhoods, work that the partnership has continued now for more than 2 decades. An architect by training, Wellington is a longtime member of Queens Community Planning Board No. 7 and serves as well as a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as we all remember with gratitude and admiration, Wellington is also a former trustee of CUNY. Wellington, welcome home to Hunter, and thank you for bringing your expertise and experience to this panel. We are also delighted to introduce Chris Kwok, Adjunct Professor of Asian American Studies at Hunter and co-editor of the timely study, A Rising Tide of Hate and Violence Against Asian Americans in New York During COVID-19. Chris is a native of Queens who graduated from the UCLA Law School, where he worked on the Asian American Pacific Islander Law Journal. For 15 years, Chris served as a civil rights attorney in the New York office of the U.S. Equal Employment Commission. Thank you for being here, Chris, and for all you do for our students. We're especially honored tonight to welcome to Roosevelt House for the first time Assembly Member Yuh-Line Niou, who is the first Asian American to represent Chinatown or any part of Manhattan in the New York State Legislature. Her district covers a wide swath of Lower Manhattan, including the Lower East Side, the South Street Seaport, the financial district where she lives, and Battery Park. In Albany, she helped form the state's first ever Asian and Pacific American Legislative Task Force, and she is effectively focused on issues like affordable housing, language access for immigrants, senior citizens issues, and now what she calls the aching pain of anti-Asian violence. We're proud to say that she earned her master's degree in public administration from another CUNY school, Baruch College. So a big welcome to a true groundbreaker, Assemblymember Yuh-Line Niou, who I see as a great role model for Hunter's students. Tonight's moderator is our own Dr. Vivian Louie, director of the Asian American Studies Center at Hunter College, where she also serves as professor of urban policy and planning. Vivian is the author of Compelled to Excel: Immigration, Education, and Opportunity Among Chinese Americans, as well as Keeping the Immigrant Bargain: The Costs and Rewards of Success in America. She also co-edits Writing Immigration: Scholars and Journalists in Dialogue. And Vivian serves on the New York State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Human Rights. Vivian, thank you for being a magnetic and transformative leader. We are grateful for your leadership and pledge that our Asian American Studies Center will be a resource in the fight against violence and discrimination. The Hunter College motto is Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. And everyone on this panel has worked passionately and effectively to ensure a better future in consistency with this motto. With tonight's urgent discussion and through the proposals that hopefully emerge from it, we extend our ongoing work to care for everyone's future in our community. Thank you to our panelists for your dedication and your inspiration. I am so pleased to turn the program over to Professor Vivian Louie.
Thank you, President Raab, for your moving words to introduce today's proceedings and your deep support for Asian American Studies. And thank you to Harold Holzer, the director of Roosevelt House, such a good partner to Asian American Studies. And I also wanted to thank the terrific Roosevelt House staff for all that they've done to bring us all together for tonight's event. Anti-Asian hate has been in the United States for more than 150 years, or about as long as Asians have been in the United States in large numbers. Anti-Asian hate has touched Americans from every part of Asia, striking when times are particularly tough. Just a year ago, I was part of another Hunter public discussion about the discriminatory impact of COVID-19. That discussion was sponsored by the Roosevelt House Human Rights Program, Hunter's Department of Africana, Puerto Rican and Latino Studies, and Asian American Studies at Hunter. I had just written a Daily News op-ed about the anti-Asian hate that was happening back then in New York City and how it was affecting our students at Hunter. So many of us who were writing and researching about that topic back then knew that more was coming our way, and our concerns were borne out. It has been the year that shouldn't have been, but it's also the year that gives us an opportunity to do things differently, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. At Hunter College in the early months of 2020, we heard from students about their own experiences with anti-Asian racism. Hunter is a largely commuter campus, and so they were experiencing these incidents as they were on the subway, as they were walking in the streets on their way to school. They were also concerned about their family members. Now we're a year later, and these feelings continue to be here, and they're well warranted, and they are continuing to happen amongst Asian Americans, young and old. At a recent Hunter community gathering that was convened by President Raab, folks shared their own poignant stories. Someone shared that her elderly father was pushed down into the street. Another person talked about how she was verbally harassed in the street. Just last month in April, President Raab generously supported 2 Hunter community trainings on how to respond to anti-Asian harassment. A student shared at one of them, with all the violence that's been taking place toward AAPI communities recently, I know we need it. I'm sure so many students and their loved ones are feeling soothed and grateful for spaces like these. Tonight, Asian American Studies is so proud to co-sponsor this discussion about next steps to counter this hate. Asian American Studies as a discipline centers on the idea that education is crucial to countering the recent violence that we've seen, to understanding how anti-Asian racism in the past 15 months and the past 150 plus years intersects with and differs from the racism directed at Black Americans, and why and how Latinos, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, women, and LGBTQ communities have been targeted in our nation, just to name a few recent cases. To understand what drives these processes and what we can do to build a better nation. You know, all our Asian American Studies courses help us pose, think through, and answer those critical questions. Our courses include Asians in the US, civil rights and the law, public policy, mental health, research methods, queerness, Muslim diasporas, courses in Filipino American literature, South Asian women writers, Asian American literature, poetics, media, and the arts. Hunter's Asian American Studies undergraduate program is 27 years strong. We offer a 12-credit minor. Hunter offers the most courses in Asian American Studies and teaches the most students in Asian American Studies amongst all our CUNY schools. We're just wrapping up 18 courses this semester, and this coming summer, we have another 5 courses. Hunter's Asian American Studies Center, launched in 2019, builds on this foundation to offer public, cultural, community, research, and academic programming, much like today's event, and to further student opportunities. A third of Hunter's undergraduate students are Asian American, and Hunter is an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institution, or ANAPISI for short. Hunter is so fortunate to have HCAP, its federally supported program that offers extensive student services and supports. Hunter College is the only school in the country to have 3 concurrent ANAPISI grants and is currently the only funded ANAPISI within the CUNY system. Asian American Studies is so grateful to have HCAP as a partner. I want to extend my thanks to the wonderful staff of Asian American Studies and HCAP for all the great work that they do. Now, some of us might know that State Senators John Liu and Kevin Thomas, the first Asian Americans elected to the New York State Senate, along with several of their colleagues, recently introduced a bill that would require all New York State public elementary and high schools to teach the historical and civic impact of Asian Americans. I like to think that Hunter's Asian American Studies and HCAP program are a model of what this can look like. And with that, I'm going to turn to our esteemed panelists. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us tonight. I just want to say a few words on format. I'm going to ask each panelist to speak in turn. I'll cue you all, and we'll have some time for some Q&A, hopefully amongst ourselves, but if not, we're just going to go straight to the Q&A from the audience, and I'm charged with keeping time. All right, so with that, we're going to start with Chris Kwok, an adjunct professor in Asian American Studies at Hunter. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
Author of the influential report, A Rising Tide of Hate and Violence Against Asian Americans in New York During COVID-19. The report is dedicated to the late Corky Lee, the acclaimed activist and photographer of Asian America. Chris, so glad that you're teaching our Hunter students, so glad that you're here. I wondered if you can give us a picture of the past 15 months. What are the main points that you think we should understand about this anti-Asian hate, its impact and its causes? That's number one. And then number two, if you can just share a few call outs about your policy recommendations and at the level that those policy recommendations should be occurring, local, state, or federal, because it's important, the level of policy action. So Chris, take it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and to be with at Roosevelt House and with everyone here. And of course, it's just such an honor to teach as an adjunct in Asian American Studies. I actually feel like someone's paying me to do this. This is pretty cool, and I feel a little weird, taking money because it is such an important thing to me, working with the students, and quite honestly, teaching the students and preparing for the class in Asian American Studies has helped me to be a better community activist and scholar. Um, the past 20 months has been traumatic for Asian Americans. Beginning with what was traumatic for all Americans, the shutdown, the pandemic. America's social fabric was really stressed. And very quickly, I think Asian Americans realized that they were going to bear additional burdens because of it. And we went into shutdown in March of 2020. So a lot of the immediate sort of violence and harassment wasn't going to occur for a while because people were home. We were all scared out of our minds. The people that were bearing some of this were the frontline workers. Many Asian Americans were frontline health workers, so they bore the brunt as they were the only ones going to work and coming back. Filipino nurses, only 4% of all nurses in America. They were 30% of all the deaths due to COVID-19 in 2020. They really came and took care of people in the front line. The other frontline workers were many African Americans and Latinos. They still had to go to work. Food delivery people, people bringing your packages. And so there were populations that bore extra brunt. As we got into the summer, we had BLM. And so we had just massive sort of social dislocation sort of rocking our society, of which Asian Americans were watching, and I think many of us were supporting. And then as we got into the summer and then, heading into the fall, there began to be more incidents as we unspooled into public for the first time. And in the February of 2021, we began to see increasing incidents of violence and harassment towards Asian Americans. Our report had been prepared in the middle of 2020 because Abney was concerned that it might not be remembered, that it would be forgotten, because Asian Americans have always been, has always felt they were invisible on so many levels. And that's a theme I want to return to. In 2021, we released it in February. And, we had specific policy recommendations at every single level because we think that every single level of government has a role to play here. At the federal level, we recommended that the White House Initiative on Asian Pacific Americans, focus on anti-Asian violence. President Biden has done so. We'll take credit for it. And at the state level, we think that the resources to attorney generals should be given to focus on the fluency and the cultural competency of dealing with Asian Americans who don't speak English fluently, and perhaps might have trouble dealing with police or district attorneys' offices. And at the city level, which is the level where people really, interact with police, we think that there needs to be more cultural and linguistic competency because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where people who need the services need to be able to communicate in a language that they feel comfortable. And we don't feel like we're quite there yet. The NYPD has made a lot of strides towards that. But one of the things we recommended was that the creation of the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, which we applauded, needed to be fully funded and also be assigned full-time people within the police department. They now have full-time jobs elsewhere within the police department, but also are called in when their linguistic ability is required. And then finally, I think coming out of that to now is the invisibility question has been nagging for me. There was one reporter who kept on saying, I keep on hearing the invisibility piece. I keep on hearing it. And I was like, you're right, I do hear that. And I thought, where did that begin? Where does that start? And I was able, strangely enough, to find a very specific case in the California Supreme Court, People versus Hall. Two white brothers, George Hall, his brother, and a third man came upon a Chinese mining camp and they robbed it. The Chinese miners tried to stop him and one was killed, shot dead by George Hall. He was found guilty of murder, but he appealed it because there was a statute that Native Americans and African Americans could not give testimony against a white man. And he said, you know what, just extend that to the Chinese person because this was meant to include every non-white person. They couldn't put us away. The word of that person, they're not part of our society. And on appeal, he won on that motion. So no Chinese person could then give testimony against a white person for any crime committed against them. And so he was set free. But the larger import of that was that Chinese people had no protection of the law. I mean, Native Americans and Blacks, for that matter, had no protection of the law. They were invisible, they were not counted. And I think the legacy of that law, and that was California Supreme Court in 1854, I think the legacy is still with us today. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Chris, for just writing the report and also laying out that incredible history and context for us. So now I'm going to turn to Wellington Chen, who is the former CUNY board trustee and of course an influential community leader. And Wellington is an expert in the next topic, which is the fact that Asian-owned businesses, including restaurants in Chinatown, were some of the earliest to experience declines at the onset of the pandemic. And this was due to the unfounded fears that COVID-19 could be transmitted through Chinese food. So Wellington, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the economic and human toll that this has taken, especially in the restaurant industry. For instance, Asian New Yorkers have filed a disproportionately high percentage of unemployment claims. We know that from a terrific report from the Asian American Federation. So that's the first question. The second is then what should we be doing in terms of policy, especially as the city moves to fully reopening, which is right around the corner. And this is particularly important in an election year with the June primaries also right around the corner.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for that gracious introduction. And also I want to, like Chris, take this opportunity to thank Hunter College, President Rob, as well as Harold Holzer, the head of the Roosevelt House, for sponsoring this important discussion. It is an excellent question, which is that, as Chris mentioned, we are the first to take the dive early on last year before the outbreak in New York City in March of 2020. We began to notice, along with everyone, and all the restaurateurs noticed that the banquets get canceled, the drastic, and by February the 7th, it's like a cliff dive. Everyone looked around and just says, "Where's everyone? Where's everybody?" And so it is. So it is good that I had to thank my board, the Chinatown Business Improvement District Board, all the volunteers. We decided what we're going to do about it. And one of the things we looked around was consult a crisis management expert. And this is to Chris' point and about Hunter's role and all the school's role, which is that history is about to repeat itself. He predicted that correctly, and turns out to be far worse than anybody thought, including Eric, the crisis management expert, because we knew that they did that to other groups, the history 100 years ago with the 1918 pandemic or the yellow fever or the cholera. So Chinatown went from about 312 eateries to the bottom in April of only about 29 eateries remaining open. We have now crawled back to about 260 still hanging on. But 260, as I always tell everyone, is not a true indicator because a lot of them have not been paying their rent. A lot of them are given forbearance, or they owe the landlord and they owe the taxes. And so that outcome is not for sure. And as well, there are also many among the other ones that have not reopened that the taxi meter is ticking. They have not gotten any income since March of last year or February or whenever they close, and they haven't received any. So the question is really about one of that we have a second virus. And as President Rob said correctly, this one has no vaccine and there's no cure in the lab that you can magically raise out, I think, because historically this tends to repeat itself. And that comes to that communication, right? What we are encouraging everyone to do, as along with Human Rights Commission and along, the people that are victims in Seattle, in all across this continent, as well as elsewhere, that we need the rest of non-Asian to step up, what I call 694. The fear about Asian American being dominant, all of the Asian combined in the pool right now is only 6% of this country. We need the other 94%. If you don't step up, whether it's harassment or not, we need your support in order to survive. Chinatown across this North America are great low-cost providers. They need volume to begin with. And when the volume stop coming, we are in deep trouble. And right now with the tourism, international tourism and tourism way down, with office worker working remotely, we do not have a very large residential base in the original Chinatown here in New York City to count on several 100,000 residents upstairs that can come on down and says, I need to get lunch, or I need to get dinner, or I need to buy my grocery. We are counting on the several 100,000 daytime workers to come in. Currently, they're in the single, we're sure several 100,000. And what you just described earlier as well, that the unease on the subway that carries 5.5 million riders every day, we are missing 3.5 million every day. And unfortunately, 68%, as Chris knows very well, of the harassed victims or attack victims are Asian women, whether they're elderly, they're young, to a point where many are fearful, anxious, afraid to come out at daytime as well as nighttime. Forget about nighttime. So as a result, the economic impact is dramatic because Chinatown at nighttime is not only there are no customers at nighttime, but very few, is becoming that the restaurant are fearful for their staff safety are closing early. And so is a double whammy of a. So I would just say that, we really need everyone's help. We have launched a campaign called for the month of Asian Heritage Month called Have You Eaten Yet? It's about the Asian greeting in many countries is not just how are you, it's about have you eaten yet? Are you okay? Do you have food insecurity? And if you have not eaten, come on down to Little Italy, come on down to Chinatown. They are suffering as much as we are, but obviously we need to figure a way out of this.
Thank you so much, Wellington. I'm now going to turn to Assemblymember New. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so appreciative. And your time. I know you came directly from the legislative session, like woohoo for us. And I'm so grateful for the insights that you're going to share. I think with us, I'm just going to ask, we'll have a little bit more of a conversation, if that's cool. And so the first question I wanted to ask you is, how have these issues really affected the day-to-day lives of your constituents in Chinatown?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that first off, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here. I love Chris, I love Wellington. We work very much together all the time in the community. And I just wanted to also say thank you to CUNY, my own home school. I was a Baruch bear cat. Folks probably know that. It's an actual animal. I had no idea until I actually Googled it, that it actually is. It's kind of cute in a scary way, I figure it's kind of like me, But I just also wanted to, say that, what Chris said was really profound. What you had said, Vivian, was really also very true. And what Wellington just described was very much what had happened to my constituents, right? I'm the first Asian American legislator to be able to represent Chinatown on the state level. At the time when all of this happened, I was the only Asian American woman in the entire New York State legislature. This was really, really devastating in a lot of different ways. But what Chris was saying about that, that invisibility feeling, right? I think that also is about lack of representation, and that comes with a lot of the erasure within our government without having that representation. And so we noticed that as we worked, right? And what you had mentioned at the very beginning, and what President had mentioned was also true, right? Asian Americans, since the day we started to be in America, anti-Asian hate has existed. Anti-Asian hate, that fear of the other, has always been. There's been history of it. There's cycles that folks go through. There's obviously the model minority myth is one that plagues us. The perpetual foreigner syndrome also plagues us. These two stereotypes are actually ways to stop us from getting benefits, stop us from actually getting help, stop us from access, and stopping us from having more representation. And so having the model minority myth, it's easy to say like, you have enough, you're doing great, and so we don't have to help you with anything. Having the perpetual foreigner syndrome there, they're saying like, well, you are not one of us, so you shouldn't get anything, like Chris was saying in that history of that case, right? And I think that there's a lot of, those things that are always cyclical. And that's why the minute that, President Trump was saying the things that he did, the minute that those Congress members were saying what they did, those words hurt our communities immediately. And it was so easy for people to digest and to just regurgitate and to be harming people immediately, because it was almost like you got permission,
Right.
You have permission to go and hurt people. You have permission to go and, say these things about people, and to, it was like hunting season was opened on Asian Americans. And it was really disturbing, this othering, right? And this, this fear, this anxiety, this apprehension that our seniors were feeling, that our communities are feeling. Those are things that are very, very real. And, my community started to feel that, I mean, not to contradict what Chris was saying, but, really at the beginning in January, Wellington, you and I saw, people were posting things online that were just about, don't go to Chinatown. The food there will make you sick. It'll make you ill. These are, this is, where they don't clean things. And I'm just like, I had to hold a whole press conference just to say, and Wellington was there, it was just to say out loud that we have to go through the same food safety standards, and we have to go through the same kinds of health department checks like as anybody else. And like, it was just like, it was disturbing that we had to say that out loud. It's disturbing that we always have to say that we're human out loud and that we belong out loud. Like this is like where, I feel like my constituents are feeling, fear. They're feeling apprehension. They're feeling this anxiety for a reason. They're feeling like people are not seeing them as human. And we saw that when, there was that horrible Waters World episode where, that one Fox News guy came into Chinatown, made fun of my seniors. Like, this isn't new. This is the same stereotypes, the same kind of rationalization that, that they use to hurt people constantly. And I remember as a small kid growing up in El Paso, Texas, in elementary school, and then just being made fun of, being bullied, just because I look different, just because they've never seen an Asian American kid before. And I was the only one in my school district until my sister started school, and so it just it's something that was perpetuated. Like, people made fun of my school lunch, people made fun of like what I brought to school, and they told me I smelled weird, and like that my hair was ugly. Like, they told me I was ugly. It was just
But you're not.
It was the same thing over and over again. But it's the same perpetual cycle of stereotyping, of hurt, of harm. And that's why it was so easy for people to gravitate towards the same kinds of racism, the same kind of hate, the same kind of rhetoric that was given to folks. And I think that, just to kind of piggyback onto some of the legislation pieces that, Chris had touched on, and that, some of the policy things that you had wanted us to kind of touch on. You had mentioned the bill that John Liu and Kevin Thomas are sponsoring. Ron and I also have a the same bill, but we're also looking at making sure that there's education in the Asian American history, and making sure that it's for schools everywhere. We wanted to make sure that we're actually able to kind of link that to some of the federal standards, and then try to see like what we can do on the education level. But we wanted to start early, right? I think that it's really important to start having good education early on, because we know that hate takes root, like, and what you were just saying was so true about the more education that people have, the more that we can actually dismantle myths and stereotypes, and actually look at the history of our own country, which is actually very, very much built on stolen land, stolen peoples, and blood, right? And I think that it's really important that we are actually talking about that. I think that we have some really good things that we did this year. We passed a budget that actually included, for the very first time, $10 million for our Asian American organizations, to be able to actually have some funding on the state level. I think that until I was elected, when I first was elected, we were able to finally get some funding to our Asian American organizations. Before I was elected, there was zero. I was, after the APA task force was formed by our speaker, and by, having both me and Ron be able to co-chair it, we were finally able to have, for the first time ever, a body dedicated towards Asian American issues in our state legislature. That task force actually made it so that we actually finally got $300,000, but that's all we got, $300,000. That's like, we have a $174 billion state budget, and we had $300,000 within our state budget for Asian Americans. And I think that goes to, again, the erasure that our
Right.
is experiencing all the time, because we have lack of representation, because we, and by the way, just some statistics for folks out there, I mean, we had, we still have less than about 2% of the state's representation, when we have more than 13% of the population, right? So there's a huge lack of representation. We are the most underrepresented ethnic group in the entire legislature. We are also the least represented on the city level. We're also the least represented on the federal level. So folks need to remember that. And so that actually is a really significant, statistic, I think, when it comes to representation in politics, and in in our representation within all of our different pieces of like levels of government, and so therefore also pieces of legislation, right? When you're talking about the laws, you're also needing to be at the table to be able to change those laws. And so one of the things that you guys had touched on was, of course, language access. Chris had talked about that a little bit, but what we need to talk about is also, data disaggregation. We need data disaggregation, because without data disaggregation, we don't have the ability to be able to tell which communities need what language, for example. And so that's really, really important to pass that bill again. This is the first time that in our budget that we actually have the funding for it. We funded it $3 million for the Department of Health to be able to put and implement data disaggregation. We still have not passed the bill. We should pass the bill this year, and hopefully the governor will sign it now that we have allocated a budget for it. And I think that this will make it so that we actually have some language access for access to benefits, etc. We also need to make sure that we have the impacts of poverty. More Asian Americans actually lives in poverty in our city. This actually makes us the most impoverished ethnic group also. So people don't realize that, because of the model minority myth and the fact that we actually are not getting the resources that we need. And so to be able to deliver those resources to the places that we need the most resources in, we need to have data disaggregation in order to do that. So that's like the best way to be able to make sure that our communities are actually getting the resources that we need.
Thank you so much. How are you? So prepared. Really put it so much out there for us, and my head is spinning. Really appreciate it. So let me just recap briefly. So of course, making sure that Asian Americans are seen as human beings, right? Countering the invisibility, making sure that we have the educational resources. It starts young, right? Making sure that we have language access, funding supports, data disaggregation. I mean, I think I'm kind of hitting some of the big highlights of what you've just shared so insightfully. So I wanted to make sure that Chris and Wellington maybe have a minute or two to respond to some of the great things that you've shared. And then I'm going to open it up to Q&A through Mac Barnett, who's our terrific Roosevelt House staff person who's gonna lead that. So Chris, did you wanna, kind of chime in with this panoramic wonderfulness that Assembly Member you put before us?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
There's any number of, long-term, medium-term, and immediate sort of things we need to do. And, I couldn't disagree with any of them. I think we need every policy intervention. And quite honestly, for Asian Americans specifically, we haven't had a lot of attention. And so to the extent that we've had Asian Americans elected, to the extent that we have Asian Americans in media, writing, wanting to write these stories, that has been a big part of what's happened. They go to the editors and go, I want to write this story. And that's been amazing. So I think all engines should fire. I don't think we should exclude any policy proposal. I think we need to discuss all of them to the extent that we disagree. But, it's great because I think it's the beginning a new era for civic engagement for Asian Americans.
Fantastic. Wellington?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that fundamentally, as Jennifer Rabb just said, that the opening remarks is about that everyone came here seeking a better life. And to dehumanize a particular group, whether it's us or any other group, is really detracting. And that's why I'm so glad another youngsters group is working with us to launch a campaign called Life is Too Short to Hate. Because if you have only 10 more minutes to live, or 10 more months to live, or 10 more weeks to live, the last thing on your mind is, I'm going to stab somebody, right? Which is what happened to me right in front of my eyes 2 months ago. 8-inch butcher knife went into a young man's back, right? So it's too close to call, too close for comfort. But I just want to assure the public that, as Chris mentioned, that NYPD now has undercover cops in Chinatown. I want to assure the public that, as long as you stay alert, you walk in pairs, you're not, the chance of you being hit by lightning is higher, technically. But obviously, there's much more work to do. And this is the part about that we need to share our common humanity, our common bond, right? Number one, you got to report. I need the people, take some training on the 5 Ds to how to distract an attacker, distract somebody who's trying to escalate the tension, to defuse and, de-escalate the situation. Help us document it, help us delegate, help us, because we need your help. As much as we are 13% in the city, is still the other 84% must step out, and there is safety in numbers. So that is something given. And so at the end of the day, it is about our common bond and our common humanity. And Chris and I was talking years ago for quite some time about, we are fascinated by our own culture and our lack of knowledge of, the beautiful fashion, the garments, the tradition, the way that foods are prepared. And, and to tie us to this vast Asian diaspora to say that you are all from Wuhan. Many of us have never been to Wuhan, including myself. And then, and so don't stereotype. And I would say that, we really need to elevate that communication about what Asians don't even know about as Asian history, let alone the outside world.
That's a great way to kind of close our formal discussion amongst ourselves, the need for Asian Americans to know about our own history and our own experiences, such a diverse group, as well as to build coalitions with folks who are not Asian American in New York City and all over to fight this. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Matt, because I see there are lots of questions in the Q&A.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for this excellent talk. audience members have been asking questions in the Q&A throughout the discussion, and so I'll share a few of those with you in a moment. First, I have a couple questions that have been pre-selected from students, Hunter students. The first for Wellington Chen from former summer interns at the Chinatown Partnership. Their names are Danying Guan and Han Teng Li. Their question for you, Mr. Chen, is, have restaurant owners been providing feedback about how recent anti-Asian hate has affected their business?
Oh, the answer is an obvious one. As Yulin mentioned, unless you live in a different world or you don't listen to radio, you don't listen to news, obviously you can see the news every day. And it has greatly affected, as you know, the most recent one is about Xi'an owner gave a famous interview about no one goes home alone, which is that two of his staff got harassed on the subway. So he's letting them go home early, but not alone. That should show you. And so if you think about some restaurant closing by 8, some restaurant closing by 9, you didn't hardly begin. You know, the normal restaurant open, you know, in the old days is at least till 11 because, you know, you could still have dinner till 10 o'clock at night and then close by 11. And so that is, there's a direct correlation and impact, very, very drastic one, not just in this Chinatown, you know, from what I'm studying and seeing is across the continent.
Would anybody else like to respond to that? Okay, no worries. Next question for Assemblymember Neo. This is from a Hunter student named Heather Otto. She asks, what is being done at the state level to ensure that Asian American and Pacific Island interests are represented and in a way that accounts for the incredible diversity of this group?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because we are very diverse. And I do think that that was one of the things that I was talking a little bit about when we talked about data disaggregation. It's so important to make sure that we actually have that data so that we can actually get the benefits and this, you know, the programs, et cetera, to be able to reflect the need that our communities have. For example, if you don't have that data, you know, if we're in you know, Chinatown. So obviously, you know, even in Chinatown, we have you know, many different dialects that are being spoken there. And so if you're going to go to a, you know, family that actually is Fujianese and you're in there and trying to speak Toisan, you're not going to actually get to have that dialogue. It's even more complicated and complex when we're in Flushing, for example, where, you know, you could be like, I need to have, you know, you check the Asian box and then somebody's out there trying to give you services and you're trying to speak in Chinese, Mandarin, or Cantonese, and they're actually Bangladeshi or Nepali, right? And so it needs to, you know, have a lot more, you know, people need to have education on how to culturally, you know, be able to communicate, culturally appropriate communication, culturally appropriate food distribution, culturally appropriate, you know, services, to make sure that folks are actually getting, you know, the services that they need. So one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that we have that data. And so the data disaggregation bill will help with that. The other thing is, this is the first time that we've actually, in our legislature, we've gotten, in this last election, 2 more South Asians. So Kevin Thomas was the first, obviously, 4 years ago, or no, 2 years ago, sorry, I dated him, 2 years ago. And then this last election, so in the last 4 months, we actually were joined by Jennifer Rajkumar and Zoran Mamdani. So these, you know, these elections are showing that we are getting more and more diverse as a body, but we're also getting more and more diverse representation, which is really great. And so we're more reflective of New York every day, but I think that we still have a long way to go, since you know, people don't realize actually that the political history of you know, Asian Americans involvement is actually very short, and it's not because of our own choice. We've had amazing folks like Mabel Lee. I don't know if people know about this. She's my favorite suffragette. She's actually well represented here by, you know, some of the folks who probably know her history. You know, she was somebody who rode in on a horse fighting for the women's right to vote. And she actually herself probably didn't get a chance to vote till almost, you know, almost 50 years after that. So white women got to vote. The women's suffragette movement, white women got to vote 50 years before Asian women and other women of color could vote. So it came in different stages, but it was really hard fought. And so Asian Americans could not vote until the Chinese Exclusion Act was lifted. So actually, when you think about it, that was only a little over 50 years. And so that's not a long time. And, Chris is all thinking, he's like, wow, the numbers. we got him thinking about the history. But yeah, so, I think that it's really important to remember that, right? Because when we're talking about, representation, when we're talking about the history of our political history here, it's longer than that. But it's really about like how much within our government that we've had representation is very short. And so we need to make sure that we're actually participating and that we're actually, being a much, much more represented voice on every level.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act was lifted only in 1943 and only because the US and China became allies. And Japan, which then became the enemy, said, America, you were really racist, and you're friends with China? China, this is really messed up. And the US was like, we better get rid of this right now. And so in 1943, they got rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But getting rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act did not mean that the Chinese that were in the country at that time immediately became part of polity. And they could naturalize. So the Chinese could naturalize beginning in 1943, but there was only a couple of thousand or 100,000 of people, very few by law. And it really wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement resulted in the Civil Rights Voting Act of 1965 that many historians call that the second founding. That's the true sort of beginning of America, when African Americans are coming into the fold. And all the other immigrants that would come post-65, post-immigration reforms, would arrive in America that had been remade by the Civil Rights Movement, the Chinese included. And perhaps they are not as studied of that history, or knowing that what they entered into, that type of America, did not always exist. It had been in the making for a long time. And so I think the more we know of that and our place in that history, how we come in, who we come in on, how the debts we owe to those that made America a more true democracy, I think is important for all of us to know as we sort of talk about these sort of political choices in civic life.
And
I think that's a great, sorry.
Just very quickly to expand on that, the trickle-down effect did not take full effect until 1980s. So the Chinese Exclusion Act basically blocked us for 100 years. And that's why I'm sitting in Chinatown, because this is the place they ran to and just say, I'll be a good boy, don't hit me. I'm not taking away your jobs. And that's what created the Chinatown that I'm still sitting in today. So it is a long cycle, but Chris is absolutely correct, and so is Yulin.
And we have to remember also one of the reasons why Chinatown is formed the way that it is, and with even the way that ownership of certain buildings are. People don't remember this, but it's in our history, in Asian American history, that Chinese people, even though they were here for so long, they were not allowed to buy property. They were not allowed to have any ownership. They were not allowed to take out loans. They were not allowed to rent. They were not allowed to do a lot of different things. And so there was a lot of different things that shaped Chinatown in that history.
Absolutely. The alien land laws and, all of these are terrific points that you all are raising, including the fact that it's the fruits of the civil rights movement that we're enjoying today, and that also gives us the leverage to do what we can to counter this moment. And then another great point is where we began, is about the origins of the Chinatowns. It began to cluster together as protection against the hate that the Chinese immigrants were experiencing quite strongly. So Mac?
Yeah. The next question is from our friend Hunter College professor Margaret Chin. She reiterates everything that is being discussed here is so important, and says that she thinks cross-racial solidarity is really important in the community. Can you please tell me if you know of any Asian American groups working on cross-racial solidarity or coalitions and what they're doing? And that's for anyone who would care to answer.
I mean, I think just as a starter, I'm so gratified to see the mass rally that filled Columbus Park to record level, and those were not just Asians. There were white, brown, Latinos, and because it's fundamentally about tying back to civil rights. An attack on one is attack on all. And so this is, and if you look at our Chinatown bid logo from day one, we didn't employ only one color. We did not employ only one symbol. We have always believed that Mother Nature believes in diversity, and otherwise you don't need the bees. Why do you need the bees to cross-pollinate? And so, and CUNY is a great example. So is Hunter, right? Because I have always remember one valedictorian on graduation said, in Holland, where I came from, everyone looks like me, talks like me, and more dangerously, think like me. Here, I not only learn from the teachers, but I'm learning from the students. And I think that was such a profound statement. And he came here just within the 2 short years, he made that keen observation. And so this is a testament to what makes New York great. Because is in university and in research in corporations, we are now into what? All talk about throwing mathematicians with biologists, with psychologists together, or that need for interdisciplinary, out the left field creative breakthrough thinking. That why didn't I think of that? And so by its nature, we are in this together.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate again what Chris was saying is so true, that our histories are so intertwined, and the things that are what gives us our rights, are the same movements, the same fights that other community groups have had to fight before us as well. And so we continue to work in solidarity. I think that there are many groups. So Margaret wanted some specific, I think, groups. And of course, there's Asian Americans for Black Lives. There's a couple of different groups out there that have worked, a lot of our nonprofit organizations have worked across all of our different groups continuously. We can talk about Apache, we can talk about Adhikar, we could talk about Red Canary Song, we could talk about all of these different groups that have constantly been, groups that are multiracial, multi-ethnic, and have been constantly and consistently been there for all of our different community groups. And, I just want to kind of hail back to my own mentors, Uncle Bob Santos out in Seattle. I just want to give him a little bit of props, but he and some of my other mentors, they were part of a group of 4 executive directors. It was Larry Gossett, who was the executive director of the Urban League. There was Roberto Maestes, who was La Casa, and then there was Bernie Whitebear, who was this, ED of Daybreak Star, and Uncle Bob was the ED of Interim in Chinatown. And the 4 of them were known as the 4 Amigos or the Gang of 4 or whatever, and whatever culture that they were talking to. But they decided that, we aren't going to fight for the same piece of pie. And I talked about, their mentorship all the time, because here we are constantly made to fight over the same piece of pie, whether it's like the Liberty Defense Fund or whatever funding or whatever thing that they have, trying to make it so that our communities are pitted against one another, trying to fight for the same funding, the same resources, the same benefits, the same things. And while we should be fighting together, and we should take the whole pie. I shouldn't cuss. So I was like, we should take the whole pie. And actually, it really is really important that we are fighting alongside one another. Uncle Bob always had, everybody fighting alongside one another to fight for the things in each other's communities that we all needed, right? So, when Chinatown was facing, the building of the Kingdom, which was going to be a huge stadium that was just going to take up all of Chinatown, they protested alongside one another. Larry Gossett came with all of the NAACP and the Urban League behind him, and the Black Panthers, and then you had, of course, all of these tribal nations coming behind Bernie Whitebear, and then you also had all of La Casa with, Roberto Maestes, and when they protested, they were huge, and they stopped that stadium from coming into Chinatown, right? And when people were fighting for the fishing wars and like trying to stop natives from fishing on public land, tribal land, actually, technically, they were actually fighting to make sure that they got that Supreme Court decision. And they all worked together to fight together on these things. And so they won. And I think that, when we fight together, we can also win together. And I think that that's one of the things that we want to continue to fight for. So thank you, Margaret, for asking that question. Thank you, Professor.
That's great. A comment followed by a question from Dave Bassnett. Dave says, one of the core tenets of the Asian American identity, especially the Asian immigrant identity, is caring for our elders, aunts, uncles, and parents. The rise in anti-Asian hatred has also created immense anxiety for Asian American youth who worry not only for themselves, but also for their parents. What is the role of Asian American and Pacific Islander youth in turning the tide against anti-Asian violence? How do we build power for students and communities?
I mean,
I love Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think the students and the social media generation don't need our help in terms of building that voice. They have the voice. I think they need our help in the sense that we should come alongside and we should sort of fill in if there's stories they should hear that they haven't heard. But social media has really emboldened this generation. I just did a webinar today with a UCLA women's basketball player, Natalie Cho, who spoke out about it. And I went to law school there, so I read it and I was like, I'm so impressed. And I asked them if I could be on a webinar with her. So I was on a webinar with her, earlier today, and it was sponsored by the Academic Achievement Program, which was a civil rights affirmative action program at UCLA, and they put on the program for us. And I would just like, every time I come in there, and I'll show you the wallpaper, that I use. I want to remind people, like, this is sort of like where we come in. Let's remember the stories. Let's remember who we should be grateful to. Part of, particularly if you're an immigrant, if you think, who are they grateful to? They think America's a white country and they let me come in, so I'm going to be grateful to the white people. I mean, just very honestly, but I think part of the story is remembering the whole story, remembering the parts that were de-emphasized, remembering the parts that were erased, remembering who fought for your right to vote, to be in here. Because before 1965, our laws were about, if you're white, you can come in. If you're not, or you're from Southern Europe, not so much. And I think that, all those things are part of, like, the youth are really driving it through their use of social media. So I don't worry too much about them.
I love that. I also wanted to say, Dave, first off, I know Dave, so I just want to say hello. But also, one of the things that is so key is, I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I was definitely my parents' first translator. I'm also one of the folks that translates all the time for the people in our community. And it is about bridging gaps. And it's also about building bridges, period. And I think that one of the things for our young people to remember is that, you are a huge bridge, whether it's a generational bridge or a language bridge or a navigational bridge of understanding how to navigate certain things. And I think that it's really incredible the amount of help that our young people have done in just the last year and a half. I mean, not for nothing, I mean, every single day we've had volunteers on the ground doing wellness checks for our seniors, doing delivery of food, doing delivery of PPE, helping people to be able to navigate the pandemic, on top of making it so that now some of my young people are walking seniors home, walking workers home from restaurants, like making it so that people are actually able to feel like they have a little bit of safety, just in numbers, right? And it's really, really helpful in that sense. So just for something to do on top of what Chris just said, because that's all true too.
I also wanted to add that, in relation to what Chris and the Assembly members said, that one of the questions, so just a shout out to Cristina Valeros, who's one of our Hunter College students, because this has been on her mind as well, is how we can build that kind of solidarity across groups to build bridges. So just to say, Chris, that yes, it is on the minds of our students for sure.
And every weekend that I'm in Chinatown, I have never seen more Black people in Chinatown than I have the last couple of weeks, like literally. And Joanne Kwong from Pearl River Mart said it separately in a webinar. She was like, I just noticed there were so many Black people. We always have Black customers, but all of a sudden there were so many. And I think, like, when I'm eating at Hubley, like, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of Black people. Like, I'm in Chinatown, there's a lot of Black people. And I think that's
You can always find Chris Kwok at Hopley.
that is the best Chinese American food, like, bar.
Please, good.
That walk is on fire, but that's a separate webinar. But they're out there quietly showing their support, I think, for the Chinese community in a very quiet way. They're just showing up.
And to add on to that point, prior to the pandemic, I had a peace pole walker that walked down from Harlem, from 125th Street, with a group of children, walking on 2nd Avenue by foot, came down to outside my office downstairs a few years ago with a peace pole, just say, this is a gift to you. And then the children from Harlem sang the song for us, choir, in front of my place, which is opposite the Jewish cemetery. That peace pole need to be unveiled again to remind us of our common humanity, because that we keep on forgetting where we came from, right? None of us, including many of the people that believe in that they need to attack Asian now, forgot that their grandparents got harassed when they got here. They got quarantined out here in the same place. And we really should be grateful. And to Chris' point and to Yulin's point, we need to see the whole picture. We are missing tremendous amount of our own legacy and our own history, let alone the other people that have paved the way. That, as Jennifer Rabb like to say, we stand on shoulders of other giants because they went through the hardship, and that makes it easier, far easier to land and go in from there. It's like, imagine landing on Normandy Beach and 3 waves had landed before you, right? Because I remember my high school teacher saying that the wave before him turned around and looked at them, knowing that they're going to get all wiped out, and they did. So that this next wave can make it to the beachhead. And this is why I always, the Chinatown Partnership, the Chinatown Bid Board has always had this point. What's the point? Remember that lady in the harbor with a statue and a torch, which is that, they all yearn for a better life. And so stop wasting time on hating one another, stabbing one another, because life is too short for that. And so I think that is to what Chris point, but we really need to talk about the contribution of the Dutch, the contribution of the Native Indians, the Native and the Asian American, the Asian history, let alone the Asian American history.
That's terrific. We are a bit beyond the hour and should look to wrap up soon. There are many good questions remaining in the queue, unfortunately, that we won't get to. But I think now would be a good time for you all to give any final thoughts that you may have before we sign off for the evening.
Education is key. Education is key, and in America, we don't suppress history. We just leave it dusty on a bookcase to be forgotten and to be ignored. And so it's there if you want it, but you have to want it, and you have to look for it. So that's the erasure. It's a very quiet erasure, and sometimes it's not so quiet. Sometimes it's very, very, very loud. But I think that we're in a signal moment for this country. Asian Americans can play a critical role, and we should.
And I just want to give gratitude to all the, I'm glad you mentioned the Hunter volunteers. All the years that we've been here, they've been people volunteering to help in many forms, many behind the scenes, quietly. I still have a group of Blue Angel advisors secretly guiding us without taking any credit, any limelight. And so many of you have done so much for this community that I cannot take enough time to thank every one of you. But be safe out there. We believe fundamentally at this moment, we need to be together because there's safety in numbers. And so we need to show solidarity. Once you show solidarity, then then it's easier to deal with the second virus.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, just a couple of things that folks can do to talk to one another is just check in with your friends, check in with people that you know, that you love, just to say like, hey, I see you. How are you? How's it going? Is it tough? Like, it's okay just to not have all the answers and everything, but just to check in because it's very isolating right now for a lot of folks. And that's, partly pandemic, but partly also just fear and anxiety and that apprehension that everybody's kind of dealing with. And just also not knowing that somebody else might be just as afraid or, whatever. So it's just really important to talk to one another. I also think it's really important to be able to change the conversation in a lot of different ways. I highly encourage, not just take Professor Flock's class or anything, but also class also, but also, make sure that we are doing anti-oppression trainings and taking upstander and bystander training. So folks who, who want to support Asian American friends, et cetera, family, et cetera, and if you're a young person who are able-bodied and want to be able to know how to, physically, safely and physically, be able to get in the way of somebody else who's being violently attacked, there are ways to do that. And upstander and bystander training is really, really helpful. There are some groups and organizations that are offering it for free. I Holla Back is one of them. And
Yes.
the other one is, the Center for Anti-Violence Prevention. So these are, amazing groups that are really, really, well-versed in training in all of these different genres. And I think that it's really important that we help folks to understand how to be helpful to one another and also how to verbally and to, physically intervene. I think that it's always important to make sure that you're staying safe, even when you're doing that. But it's always good to, have that knowledge in the back, in the back pocket, in part of your toolkit, in order to make sure that, you're able to help change the dialogue or change somebody's action or to save somebody's life. I think that it's really important. And I also wanted to just say that, one of the other things that, folks can do right now is to actually, talk to the folks who are elected, the people who are, in, city, state and federal seats that just talk about your experience, and I think that it's okay to do that. And it's really tough sometimes to provide that space even for yourself. And so it's okay to do that. And make sure that people understand why it's important that there are resources for our communities.
Wow, thank you. I wanted to just give my thanks to all the terrific panelists, to all the great questions that the audience presented. I see there's 31 now, but unfortunately we do have to close. And to thank President Raab and Harold Holzer and his entire wonderful Roosevelt House staff, the Asian American Studies staff, and HCAP staff for all the great work that they do every day on the ground, and all the faculty who teach our terrific courses in Asian American Studies at Hunter College, which tackle these really deep questions that you all have posed, and all the key points that we've made tonight, and the Asian American Studies Center for moving forward with this kind of public programming. Thank you to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to everybody who joined.